Hello and welcome from Monhegan on this lovely spring afternoon. I'm Jenn Pye, the director of the Monhegan Museum of Art and History. And while everyone's getting settled in, I'd like to take a few minutes to share some of the exciting things that we have happening here at the museum. So first off, we're feeling cautiously optimistic about our summer season, and we recognize that a lot of you are anxious to return to Monhegan. So with that in mind, we are planning to open the gallery, the Keeper's House, and the Rockwell Kent James Fitzgerald Home and Studio this summer. In the gallery, we're going to have the long-awaited exhibition, Cape Ann and Monhegan Island Vistas, Contrasted New England Art Colonies. This show was curated by museum trustee Jim O'Gorman, and it explores the relationship between the art colonies of Monhegan, Maine, and Cape Ann, Massachusetts, through the work of 24 artists who painted and sometimes lived in both locations. It will include works by Teresa Bernstein, Eric Hudson, Leon Kroll, James Fitzgerald, Dawn Stone, and a number of other artists. Another exciting project next that the entire staff has been working on through the pandemic is a multimedia online exhibition called World War II, On Island and Abroad. This exhibition uses photographs, artworks, oral histories, news articles, and film footage to tell the stories of the Monhegan residents who served abroad and also those who remained here on island. So I encourage you to check this out at our website, monheganmuseum.org/WW_I. And this project was generously supported by a National Endowment for the Humanities CARES Act grant. And so on the topic of support, while this event is free, we really appreciate your support. So if you're already a member, thank you. And if you'd like to donate or become a member, we make it really easy for you to do on our website. And so it seems like most of our participants have logged on. And so I'd like to hand this over to Will Coleman. Will is a valued member of our board of trustees, and he's a lifelong Monhegan visitor and the director of collections and exhibitions at the Olana Partnership in Hudson, New York. Welcome, Will.
Thanks very much, Jen, and thanks to all of you for choosing to join us for this second ever virtual art history talk to benefit the Monhegan Museum of Art and History. I know there are a lot of virtual programs these days beckoning for your time and energy, so we appreciate you spending an evening with us to learn a little more about a topic, and I will advance the slide. The topic of one of the pioneering artists of what became one of the major American art colonies, Samuel Peter Rolt Triscott, from a particularly knowledgeable speaker. Just a few quick technical notes as we get started. Hopefully we're all very familiar with how Zoom works by now, but just wanted to acquaint you with the functions you're seeing. You will be seeing one or three faces in the top right corner of your screen. You have control over where those people are and how many of them you see. So if you find that the speaker's face covers a portion of the image that you want to see, just click the black bar above those images and you can drag them anywhere. And you can also use the little minus sign to make them go away altogether. You will see an additional function that you might not be familiar with from the standard Zoom meeting format, because we're using the nifty webinar mode where you have the Q&A. So the chat function is great for just saying where you're tuning in from and commenting on the images. The Q&A might be a place to log a question for later response by our honored guest today, Earle G. Shettleworth Jr. So please do use that function. And hopefully the technology behaves smoothly. Please bear with us if there's any little freezing along the way. You know how it is. Without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker. Earle G. Shettleworth Jr. has been Maine State Historian since 2004. He's been a long-time supporter of the Monhegan Museum and a friend to this place. I recall I was telling Earle, seeing him speak on the celebration of the quadricentennial of John Smith's landing on Monhegan Island. So he's had a long journey with this place, this institution, and then also with this person and this topic. And so we're going to have a really special perspective into this pioneering artist. That word comes up for a number of reasons. Not only was he one of the earliest professional artists to really devote themselves to the practice of Monhegan art, He was a pioneer in the art of watercolor, which was just becoming a major medium after long being out of fashion. And then, as Earle's title reminds us, practicing photography in really unusual ways. So stay tuned. There are going to be some very strange hybrid objects somewhere in between painting and photography as this artist deployed these media in new and unexpected ways. So Earle has had a long journey with this artist. He goes way back. He's been unearthing lost objects by Trisket. He's been studying him. He's been collecting him. He's indeed been gifting works by Trisket to the Monhegan Museum, for which we're all very grateful. So he understands this painter and photographer and creative voice like few others. He's a native of Portland, a Mainer to the core, graduated from Deering High School, Colby College, and Boston University, and then received honorary degrees from Bowdoin College and the Maine College of Art. He became architectural historian for the Maine State Historic Preservation Commission in 1973, and then began a long service as director of that organization in 1976, from which he retired in 2015. So an incredibly knowledgeable speaker here, to which I will now turn over the floor and turn off my own camera so we can focus on Earle, and take it away, Earle.
Thank you very much, Will, for that very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you all virtually. As Will mentioned, I've been interested in Samuel Peter Rolt Triscott for a long time. Discovered him first through his photography, which we'll get into a little bit later, and then that led to his paintings, which led to a major exhibit on both at the Monhegan Museum in 2002, which was then carried to the mainland, to the Portland Museum of Art. And out of that came a catalog, which I co-authored with the late Richard Malone. So let's go to the first slide. Next, please. Yeah. This is back, Will. There we go. This is a photograph of Samuel Peter Rolt Triscott late in life. Just give you a little bit of biographical information before we move on to the paintings and the photographs. He was born in 1846 in Gosport, England. He was the son of Captain William E. Triscott of the Royal Navy. Gosport is located right across the bay from Portsmouth, which of course is one of the great British naval centers. He was born into a very comfortable middle-class life, was well educated as both a civil engineer and as a watercolor artist in London. We believe he attended the Royal Academy of Watercolors. And then in 1871, at the age of 25, he immigrated to Massachusetts, first working in Worcester as a civil engineer. By 1874, he was exhibiting and selling his watercolors of Massachusetts subjects. And then he expanded in the 1870s to paint anywhere from Connecticut up into the Canadian Maritimes. By 1879, he had moved to Boston, and in 1880, he left his work as a civil engineer to commit the rest of his career to being a watercolor artist. In 1888, while still based in Boston, he spent 6 months in England painting in the Devon countryside of southern England, and we'll see some wonderful watercolors that he did in that period of his life. A student of his, Sears Gallagher, who also became a very well-known Boston watercolorist, convinced him to come to Monhegan with him in 1892. Sears Gallagher had already discovered Monhegan, and that summer Trisket had what so many of us have experienced, that Monhegan epiphany, in which he just was completely embraced by the island, completely enthusiastic about it. And he returned the following summer in 1893 to buy a fisherman's house. And then by 1902, he had given up Boston altogether and decided to live year-round. He was the first artist in Monhegan's history to live year-round on the island, and he lived there until his death in 1925. And then after his death, as we'll see again as we go on, a large number of watercolors were left to his housekeeper and along with his house, and these are how many of the paintings survived. Next, please. Here we're looking at one of the earliest known watercolors. This was done in his Massachusetts period, the Merrimack River near Franklin Falls, New Hampshire, 1874. Here we're looking at really a very classical mid-19th century English watercolor, even with the ladies in the foreground who are making their own drawing or painting of the scene. The style is very tight, very detailed, really goes well back into the 19th century. Gives us a flavor for what his early work was like, particularly through his English training. Next. Here's another watercolor very much in the same style. This is a lake in Massachusetts near Worcester, done in 1878. Even then, though, he was beginning to experiment, beginning to push watercolor to the edge, and you can see the remarkable quality that he creates on the water of that lake, almost a kind of mirror-like feeling that he's achieved out of the paper and the paint. Next. By the 1880s, he was spending summers all over New England and into the Maritimes and doing beautiful, looser watercolors than those early ones from the 1870s. This is a view of the marshes on the North Shore of Massachusetts from the 1880s. Next, please. And here's a nice little watercolor of a fishing village in Cape Breton, 1883. Next. And a lovely watercolor of Kennebunkport. He began to paint watercolors in Maine in the 1880s, was particularly favored the villages along the south shore of the Maine coast. This is the old meeting house that is the center of Kennebunk Village even to this day. Next, please. And then in 1888, as I've mentioned before, he returned to England for 6 months. We believe that part of that trip was to help his family to settle his father's estate. And during that time, he did many beautiful watercolors of the English countryside, particularly of Devon, particularly of southern England. This is called The Edge of the Village, Chagford, Devon, England. Very loose, beginning almost to feel a little bit impressionistic. And also we now see the sheep, which will also be very characteristic of many of his Monhegan watercolors, at least up until the point when sheep were allowed on the island, as well as the birds. Next, please. Here's a street scene in a village in Devon. And as an architectural historian, I particularly favor some of these English watercolors from 1888. Devon has a very distinctive domestic architecture with the plastered exteriors and the thatch roofs, and indeed he expresses them very nicely. Next. Here's another example. And look in particular at this wonderful large chimney on the house, the thatched roof house in the village in Devon, because we're going to see that chimney again on Monhegan before long. Next, please. Now, when he returned, he continued his career in Boston from 1888, as I mentioned, until 1902, although he was spending more and more time on Monhegan after he bought the house in 1893. In fact, there are indications that from letters to his dealer, Macbeth, that he actually spent some winters in the 1890s on Monhegan. He also was, I think, beginning to take a little bit of a jaundiced eye, once he'd been exposed to Monhegan, of the art world in Boston and elsewhere. He had been very active in the 1880s and 90s in displaying his watercolors in exhibits in the large cities of the East Coast. But this is a rather delightful watercolor that actually is a satire. In the lower left-hand corner, you see the signature AMOV, and then he has gathering the fold. Well, this is a takeoff on a watercolor that was done by a French artist that was also a satire, in which the sheep are actually the buying public, the public who is uninformed about buying art. And they are being herded into an art gallery, which is Jordan Marsh, where art was sold for the middle class in Boston, because Jordan Marsh was a great department store. And here from this very simple but delightful watercolor, I think we get his sense of his beginning to break away from the urban life and looking to Monhegan as a very special refuge. Next, please. And so, beginning in the summer of 1892 and extending almost to his death in 1925, he creates this extensive body of beautiful watercolors that celebrate every aspect of Monhegan. And we're going to look first at the village. This is from Horns Hill, looking down on the village with Manana in the background. This is one of the early ones, and you can see the sheep in the background, and there are one or two of those seagulls in the sky, probably from the 1890s. Next, please. Here, a wonderful photograph. The woman is unidentified. Trisket is in the center as a young man, relatively young man, and at the right is his close friend and fellow watercolorist, Frank Myrick, who also was very active on the island in the 1890s, and they're viewing the Monhegan headlands. Next. This is the little house, the fisherman's house, that Trisket bought in 1893. And this is a photograph taken prior to the construction of his Devon stone chimney, the porch, and the dormer window. This is as he bought it in 1893. Next, please. And here in this wonderful, vivid watercolor, we see how he transformed this simple vernacular structure into his home for the balance of his life from 1893 until the 1920s. There is his Devon stone chimney at the left. That was for the fireplace for his studio. He used that wing of the house for his studio. And then we also have this large dormer window where he might have at various times painted as well, if the light was right, if the angle was right, in the attic story of his 1.5-story domain. What we also see in the foreground here is what every self-respecting Englishman should have, a beautiful garden. And this, again, I think is very much a part of his English heritage, his English background. He prided himself on his flower gardens that surrounded his house. Next, please. And here, indeed, in photographs that he took at the turn of the century, we see some of the flowers and plants that surrounded his house. Next, please. Fortunately, he took some interiors of his home. This is his living room, and you can see it was a very simple home, but a very comfortable one, very Victorian in feeling. Next. Here's another view. Clearly, he loved to cultivate flowers and plants inside his house as well as outside. And it's amazing what artifacts can survive on the island. If you look to the left, the lower of the two shelves has a silver tea set. Of course, again, being an Englishman, he probably served tea from time to time to his guests, and that tea set managed to survive and is now in the collection of the Monhegan Museum. Next, please. Here's a view of the room that he used as his studio with that wonderful stone fireplace. And in the foreground is a folio with opened to one of his watercolors. And here's his easy chair at the right with his guitar. One can imagine that making the commitment beginning in 1902 to live year-round on the island, he really made a commitment to this house, to this place, and created a sort of a comfortable world for himself. Next, please. And here's a view of another one of the rooms. And everywhere in these photographs, you see paintings hanging. Some of them might be his, some of them might be the work of other artists. Oftentimes, artists would trade with each other. Next, please. And throughout his life on the island, he loved cats. And here's a photograph of a group of 3 kittens in a basket photographed by him. Next. Here is Trisket at his garden gate about 1910 with his sailor's cap on, talking to a young admirer. Next. Now let's look at the various aspects of the island as portrayed by his watercolors. We look first at this lovely, probably 1890s, I believe the date is actually March 1897 watercolor of Manana at the left and the harbor. Next. Here's a wonderful watercolor of the fish houses on Fish Beach and one of the great storms of the 20th century took out the fish house at the right, but the fish house at the left is the eider duck, which was later converted by the Cabot family into a group of studios and is now used as a rental cottage. Next, please. This is a particularly fine watercolor that shows in the center of the village the Stanley Fish House, the Trefetherin Barn, the Starling Fish Houses. A wonderful combination of very detailed, very draftsman-like rendering of the vernacular architecture of the village, set in a much looser, much more impressionistic setting, both in the foreground and particularly with the outline of Manana shadowing in the background. Next. And another of the wonderful landmarks that existed in the village in the late 19th century. This is the Pink House, which was a very early cape built in the early 19th century, and is now the site of the Island Inn. This beautiful watercolor with the marsh in the foreground, with the rocky area of Manana in the background, was done in 1896. Next. And here a lovely sort of impressionistic sketch from Horns Hill showing the village with Manana looming in the background. One of the most identifiable landmarks, of course, is the influence, the Trefetherin House of 1826 that appears to the left. Next. And here from January of 1898, we have this really steely cold watercolor of the island village in the winter. And I just want to share with you a period note that he wrote literally that same year, only in November of 1898, to his dealer, William Macbeth. I have spent the last 2 winters on the island and have painted out of doors every month of the year. And as you may not know the location of the place I will mention that it is 2 miles out at sea from the 10 miles out at sea from the nearest point of the coast of Maine that I have had the great chance to paint surf and show such as cannot be shown on the mainland. Next, please. Other village landmarks captured his attention. This is the Wickwhack, which was one of the fishing sheds near the landing. Next, please. And here another one of the fishing docks. You can see the seines drying on the dock. This was known as the Hermitage. And I like this watercolor in particular, again, because of the tension between the careful draftsmanship of the building, the vernacular building on the island, and yet the beautiful way he handles the simplicity and the impressionistic feeling of the background. Next, please. Now we move to the south end of the island. And we're looking at the Crow's Nest, which was a real landmark on the island for many, many years, the southern part of the island. This windblown tree above Lobster Cove. Next. And again, we're on the south end of the island with sheep grazing. The sheep, of course, were removed from the island around 1900 after protestations from animal rights groups of the time, but they appear in many of Triskett's watercolors. Next, please. Here we're again at Lobster Cove at the beach, and here I think you see the wonderful command that he has of watercolors to create this effect of where the surf meets the land. And we'll see in a couple of the watercolors, but it's present here to some degree, that moment, that line, that horizontal line when the surf hits the shore, and there's this translucency, there's this light color, often this turquoise color, and he captures that very beautifully. And then, of course, the fog out at sea with just a hint of vessels in the background. Next, please. Again, a wonderful impressionist feeling to this. We're looking here at one of the headlands with one of these windblown pines. This has a very sort of Japanesey feeling to it, particularly with the pines. And this is something that we'll see also in quite a bit of his photography in the early 20th century. In many ways, he's captured both the Japanesey effect and the feeling of artwork of the arts and crafts period of the turn of the century. Next, please. And here, a masterful capture of one of the headlands. This is a watercolor, which he also, as we'll see, used often as a photographic subject as well. Next, please. Now we're looking at the base of one of the headlands. And here again, we see both the English influence, but also the English influence as translated to America with the interest of many artists, particularly watercolor artists, on recreating nature in a very exacting way, a really very careful study of nature. And this also goes back to the fact that in the early 19th century, there was a great burst of knowledge and interest in geology, and that transferred into the art world. And so I think what we're seeing here is a manifestation of that interest both by English and American artists in the natural world, and in this case, in the geological configuration of the base of the headlands. Next, please. And then again, you know, if we're talking about the Oriental or the Japanese influence of the late 19th and early 20th century, this is the top of one of the headlands in winter with that wispy little tree-like bush at the upper right, and this wonderful kind of lyrical open feeling to his brushwork. Now he's really loosening up, and at the same time creating a really effective rendering of this location in winter, but it also has this very Japanese effect to it. Next, please. Here he's even taking it a step further. This again is winter on the top of the headlines with these wispy trees. Now we're getting very Oriental and very impressionistic with the moon in the background. Next, please. And finally, we go almost abstract with this view of sea smoke in the harbor. Manana is somewhere there on the left, and there's all of this wonderful sea smoke created by his watercolor in the harbor. Next, please. Now, throughout his life as a painter, from when we know him in America as early as 1874 until the 1920s, he is a painter almost entirely of watercolors. Apparently he tried in the 1880s to do a few oil paintings, and again when he was on Monhegan he tried a few, but he was not comfortable with it. It was not really his genre, and yet he was very successful with it. There are only a couple Monhegan oil paintings known. This is Surf, probably at the southern end of the island, which is an oil painting rather than watercolor. Next, please. And this is known as Beyond Lobster Cove, the surf coming in at Lobster Cove, again an oil painting. But as I say, he was apparently not personally comfortable. No, he was certainly accomplished from these two paintings we can see in the art of oil painting, but watercolor was really his genre. Next, please. And now we turn to photography. Just very briefly, a quick review, an overview. Photography was invented for all intents and purposes, for modern purposes, by Louis Daguerre in 1839. And the process of the daguerreotype came to America that fall of 1839 and was very quickly employed by many across America. By the mid-1850s, there was an entirely new process that was introduced. It was known as the glass plate negative. And the glass plate negative made it possible to print photographs on paper and also to print multiple images, whereas the daguerreotype was just the one image. There was no negative. There was no way to reproduce it. However, the glass plate negative photography remained largely the purview of professionals during the 1850s, 60s, into the 1870s, in part because it was necessary for the photographer to actually have his studio nearby or to bring his studio out into the field, because the glass plates in their original process had to be quickly developed. We think, for example, of Matthew Brady and his great Civil War photography and the fact that he had to have literally a traveling studio with him near the battlefield to develop his photographs. But by the 1880s, there was a new process developed, the dry plate process, which liberated photographers from having to immediately develop their photographs. And this widely opened the availability and the popularity of photography, particularly in England and America, and a whole new group of people, including the artists now, adopted photography. And in the case of Samuel Trisket, he used it very creatively in many different ways, as we'll see. This is his photograph of near Fish Beach, one of the fish houses with the harbor and Manana in the background. Next, please. In this particular case, he's photographed this scene, he's developed the photograph, and he's using it literally as a sketch, as a sketchbook. He probably based this lovely watercolor of Fish Beach area upon the photograph that we saw a moment ago. Next, please. Here's a view of downtown Monhegan, the center of the village, the little curving path through the village, some of the houses to the left still standing, and keep this photographic image in mind. Next. This is called Stormy Day, Monhegan Village. It's the exact composition, only he's turned it into a much more flowing watercolor and has a lady being battered by the storm with her umbrella walking down the central path of Monhegan Village. Next, please. Here's a view from across the marshes, the back of the little houses that form the central village of Monhegan. A photograph. Next, please. And here's his watercolor based upon the photograph. Next, please. Now we get even more literal in learning about how much he relied, in some cases, upon photography. This is a view of the woods in Monhegan, a photograph. And this is the watercolor based directly on the photograph. Next, please. And we're looking here at one of the gullies out near the headlands, photograph, and corresponding watercolor. And one more of these pairs. Here's a wave coming in on Lobster Cove. And there's the corresponding watercolor. Next, please. Now, from the time that Trisket made a commitment in the 1890s to spend his life on Monhegan Island, he really had two sources of income from his artwork. One was the summer visitor. The other, of course, was sending his watercolors to Boston and New York galleries, to places that he'd already established commercial connections with in his earlier life before he went to Monhegan. By the late 19th, early 20th century, photography had began to play more and more of an important role in his artwork. And not everyone, although I'm sure his watercolors were relatively reasonable in price, and he certainly produced large numbers of them. At the time of his death in 1923, it was recorded in his probate inventory that there were still 300 unsold watercolors in his estate. But nonetheless, I think he wanted to appeal particularly to the summer visitors on Monhegan who might not be able to afford a watercolor, that they could buy a photograph of his in which he overpainted, in which he tinted. So it's this tension, this fascinating really combination of both photograph and watercolor. And in these next pairs that I'm going to show you, it's really challenging sometimes to see where the photograph ends and the watercolor begins. Here we're looking at Fish Beach, a photograph. Next. And here he's taken a copy of that photograph. He's printed it in his photographic studio, which was presumably in his house. And then he's sort of lightly tinted over it. Now, the tinting of photographs is something that really was going on from the beginning of photography in the 1840s and 50s, so that this in and of itself is not unusual. And in this case, I think we can see still some of the structure of the photograph in this combination photograph watercolor. Next, please. Here's a view of the entrance to his garden and to his home. Next. And here again, a fairly light overpainting of watercolor. So you can still see some of the photographic quality as it combines and tensions with the watercolor. Next, please. But here, as we move into the cathedral woods, is another matter. This is the photograph. Next. And here is the watercolor. And here, I think there is a photograph upon which a watercolor has been placed. It's really as much watercolor, if not more so, than photograph. Next, please. Now, in addition to these tinted photographs or overpainted photographs, he also, by the early 1900s, was producing very fine black and white and sepia photographs that were not overpainted. These were probably the lowest cost offering that he had in his studio. In 1911, my predecessor as state historian, the first state historian, Henry Burridge, and his daughter, who was an artist, Mildred Burridge, spent 3 weeks together on the island one summer, that 1911 summer, and they wrote back every day to Henry's wife, Mildred's mother, about their experiences there. And 2 or 3 times they talk about going to Mr. Trisket's studio and buying sepia photographs from him. And there are a fair number of these, and they're quite wonderful. This is a print from one of the negatives of the headlands, again with these wispy trees that you see in his watercolors. And again, these wonderful windblown trees are very much a part of early 20th century arts and crafts photography. You see them on the West Coast in California, as well as on the New England photographs. Next, please. Here's another photograph. This one is actually not printed from a negative. This is from a print that he made that was sold. And again, a wonderful impressionistic feeling, the headland in the background. The wispy tree is the central subject matter. Next, please. Trisket was looking for commercial activities. He certainly had become a good New Englander by the turn of the century. This is a photograph that he took of a stormy day on Fish Beach, and he sold it to G.W. Morse and Company of Portland, who were postcard makers. Next, please. And so in 1905, we find Fish Houses and Surf at Monhegan, published in Germany for G.W. Morse, because most of the color postcards were made in Germany at that period, and it's based directly on a photograph that Trisket would have sold to the Morse Company. Next, please. Now, for the balance of our consideration of Samuel Peter Rolt Trisket, we're going to transfer over entirely to photographs of the island that he took. We're going to move through these fairly quickly, but I think they give you a sense that he was not only a very gifted watercolor artist, but he also was an extraordinarily gifted photographer as well. There are 3 or 4 major photographers who worked on Monhegan in the late 19th, early 20th century. They include Edward Robinson of Thomaston, Eric Hudson, who himself was an artist, and there are others. Maud Briggs Knowlton's husband is a recent addition to our understanding of these wonderful photographers. But in many ways, Trisket really is the master. We're looking here at two mackerel schooners with seine boats towing astern off Monhegan in search of a school of fish. This would have been taken from the southern end of the island. Look at how he's able to capture the sunlight on the water and the wash of the wave on the rock in the foreground with the sunlight hitting it. Next, please. Here is his photograph of the packet Effort sailing into Monhegan Harbor, completing her customary passage from Booth Bay Harbor. This was one of the few ways that you could get to Monhegan in the late 19th and early 20th century before the steamboats came in the latter part of the first decade of the 20th century. Built in Boston in 1854 as a Boston pilot schooner, the Effort was best known for her long service as the Monhegan packet under the command of Captain Will Humphrey. And she sailed back and forth several times a week between Monhegan Harbor and Booth Bay Harbor. Next, please. Here, a wonderful photograph of Manana Island in the background, Monhegan Harbor, and Monhegan Village with a northwest gale blowing outside the harbor. Look at those white caps in the upper right-hand corner. And familiar landmarks, of course, include the big hip-roofed house of 1826, the Trefetheren house at the right, known as the Influence. Next, please. Here, a wonderful moment caught in time of the fishermen on the beach, on Fish Beach. And of course, part of the modus operandi of fishing on Monhegan was that there would be maybe one boat go out and try to spot for schools of fish, and then the word would come, and then the fishermen who were waiting on the harbor would man their boats and go out to fish. Next. Here, a lovely photograph. This is, again, the packet Effort, and she's seen departing by way of the back door through the Heron Gut between Smutty Nose and Monhegan. At the right, this is the point of land that is the current day boat landing. Next, please. Here, a close-up of the Influence, built by Henry Trefetheren, as I've mentioned, in 1826. The east side was purchased by artists William Kloss and Alice Sweat in 1899. And you can see all this wonderful growth of shrubbery over the building and the garden in the foreground. Next. Of course, Monhegan, being at least 10 miles out in the middle of the ocean, often the site of shipwrecks, and we have a couple photographs of them by Trisket. This is the Swallows. Oh, pardon me. This is the wreck of the schooner E.M. Sawyer of New Bedford, about 1904. She was built in Jonesport, Maine in 1869, and her home port was Machias. Certainly, there was a kind of bittersweet aspect to shipwrecks on Monhegan in the 19th and early 20th century. Certainly a terrible occurrence, but at the same time, also an opportunity for many of the local inhabitants to add a few things to their households as well. Next, please. Here's the wreck of the schooner John Soames of Calais in Lobster Cove, Monhegan, circa 1896. This vessel was built on Mount Desert in 1868. And in the background, we see Manana and the Tower of the Fog Station in the center of the photograph. Next, please. Surf crashing on the Washerwoman, well-known rock at the southern tip of Monhegan. Next, please. Gull Rock. Next, please. I'm sorry, this is Gull Rock. That was the crow's nest. Why don't we go back, Will? That's the crow's nest, as we saw in the watercolors. Next, please. And here's Gull Rock. Next, please. And then we move to the headlands. Whitehead from Gull Rock. Now we're back in the harbor in the midst of winter. We're looking from Manana into the harbor with the village at the right. Just imagine, because Trisket would have had a large glass plate view camera with a tripod, how he would drag it up the shores of Manana in the middle of the winter to take this photograph. But photographers were very dedicated in those days. Next. Here's a wonderful view. Lighthouse Hill from the cherry trees across the influence in winter. You can see the keeper's house at the left, the assistant keeper's house, and the lighthouse. And finally, for these winter scenes of the village, this is Monhegan village from Horns Hill in winter, not unlike the watercolor that we saw of the same subject. And again, look at that heavy, matted, wet snow, and look at that. Even though this is a black and white photograph, it captures the sort of steely gray quality and the power and force of being on the island in winter in the 1890s. Next, please. And finally, again, you can feel the cold in this photograph. This is the Gull Rock area in winter, looking out to the open ocean. Next, please. Here we have Trisket with Frank Pierce, one of the local residents of the island. This is as he's getting along in years, probably taken somewhere between 1910 and 1920. Trisket became a beloved figure on the island, beloved particularly by the fishermen who greatly respected him. And it is said that when he died in 1925, they were there to bring him to his burial site in the cemetery on the island. It's said also that as years went on that he rarely, if ever, left the island. And when the first motorized vehicle came to the island in the 19-teens, it was brought up to his house because it had been thought that he had probably never seen an automobile or a mechanized truck. In many ways, his life really parallels that of other great Maine artists who choose to focus upon a small world and then explore that world in every aspect of it through their art, and in Trisket's case, through its photography. It makes us think of Winslow Homer and Prout's Neck, and Andrew Wyeth and Cushing. And indeed, as Trisket ended his years, we'll have the next slide, please. Here he is with his cat Spider in 1919, now a very old man. He never lost his love for painting, although by the 19-teens, he was losing his eyesight. And one day, a young woman on the island came into his studio, and she saw two beautiful new paintings of the headlands. And she said, "Mr. Trisket, you've walked to the headlands." And he said, "No, I really can't do that anymore." But he said, "It's all in my mind's eye." And so he continued to work until his death in 1925. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Earle. What a rich and fascinating talk. So many beautiful and intriguing objects. Do you want to go into your secret postscript now? Or,
yes, indeed.
Okay.
Yes, the PS of this lecture.
All right. see if I can get that up.
One of the joys of doing research and then sharing it with others is that those others often know something that the researcher doesn't know or doesn't have, and that truly is the wonderful thing of broadening one's knowledge. When this lecture was first advertised online, Toby Avery, who lives out in California, but who has connections with Monhegan through his grandfather and other members of his family, he wrote to me and said that I have 6 watercolors by Trisket that were purchased by my grandfather after Trisket's death, because the family who inherited Trisket's house and his estate for years afterwards, with the help of Maud Briggs Knowlton, sold those 300 watercolors that were in his estate. They were sold during the summers off the porch of the Trisket house, and I can imagine sold very reasonably. And so it was at that point, sometime in the 1920s probably, that Toby's grandfather bought 6 watercolors, and they've descended now to the 3rd generation, to Toby. And one of them is of Monhegan, and this is the Monhegan one with a full SP Rolt Triscott signature. And again, the birds in the sky. Next, please. But the balance of them, and it's very interesting that his grandfather chose mostly the English ones. I think the English ones are very much underappreciated, partially because the English subject matter, not American, not Maine, not Monhegan. But of course, again, as I said during the lecture, as an architectural historian, I just love seeing the variety of English vernacular architecture that he found in these Devon villages in 1888. And here's a pair of them. These are owned by Mr. Avery from his grandfather. Next, please. And here are 2 more that show scenes in Devon. And then this is a Devon scene, and this is really lovely. Will and I were talking about this watercolor before the program started, and we were comparing notes, and we were saying there's something of Constable in this watercolor, and there's something of Corot. So it's SP Rolt Triscott, who was born in England, went to New England, but when he returned to England, decided to create a wonderful sort of hybrid of both English and French art. And so we end our images on that note.
There was also the Dr.
Oh, yes, that's
himself,
right.
Yeah.
Yes, forgive me. Also, Toby has shared with us that his grandfather took watercolor lessons, probably would have been in the early 1920s or so, from Trisket. And these are 2 watercolors that his grandfather did of Trisket. You know, one of presumably from the rocks on the southern end of the island and the other of the village.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to stop the screen share there. Thank you so much, Earle. What a fascinating talk. Well, I've been in screen share mode. I haven't been able to see what's been in the chat and Q&A, but it looks like we have some good questions lined up. A benefit to being the moderators, you get a kind of front row seat. So maybe I can get one question I've been chewing over while learning from you here today, Earle. We've got a talk that it occurs to me as you're speaking is perfect for the Monhegan Museum of Art and History. So you've given us the fishing industry, the lived experience of this place, whereas I come to this as an art historian focusing on landscape painting, really fascinated by the ways in which this liminal hybrid artist is toying with the boundaries of the 19th century and early 20th century American art world, and not confined by any of them. One thing I'm struggling with is this historic rivalry of the arts, the paragone, the challenge that photography is this act of mechanical reproduction that is supposedly merely pushing a shutter. So it has this inbuilt opposition that it is not artistic as painting is, but you've presented someone to us who does not seem to feel that contradiction at all. So I'm fascinated as we look through these things by the ways in which he's using the possibilities of painting to counterbalance the limitations of photography in the period, adding color from paint to photography. And then also maybe even thinking about the depth of field of photography in paint. So I'm curious, most of all, if you think that he is conceiving of his photographic work as an artistic act. I guess we should not take that for granted. Is this a mere documentary or journalistic practice, or does he think of himself as an artist when he takes up that dry plate process? Or is his only artistic work, and where his heart really lies as an artist, in watercolor?
Well, I think that it's a combination of both, Will. I think that he may have come to photography, like many painters of the mid to late 19th century, as a vehicle, almost as a sort of second sketchbook, you know. But I think that as he got into it, he realized that it was an art form. And I think, of course, he has the wonderful artist's eye to begin with, so that even if he's just taking these photographs of the island to look at later on to make paintings from, they stand out alone as works of photographic art. But then, of course, as we've seen, he experiments with them. He overpaints them in various ways. And then he actually offers the public, by the turn of the century, yes, you can go to his studio and you can buy a watercolor from him. But you can also buy an overpainted photograph, and you can also buy a photograph. So I think the fact that he adds those latter two to his repertoire of what he offers his public indicates to me that he considers those art forms as well, and he's really trying to make his art available to as many people as possible. The latter two are far less expensive than the watercolors.
Makes sense. He's an artist who is sensitive to his market and offering a variety of ways to take home a piece of the place. That's
exactly. Yeah. I saw a little note from Peter Falk. Can we recognize him? He said he had his hand up.
That's a question for Jen. Yeah, we had not planned to switch on other people's cameras, but maybe we can do that for a special guest here. So
Susan Strickler did have a question a while back, so could we?
Oh, sure. We can field any and all questions.
Yes, Susan wanted to know if there was any evidence that Trisket had students on Monhegan, either in watercolor or photography.
Right. Well, in the research that I did, I didn't find any evidence of students for watercolor. However, of course, in the recent email correspondence that I've had with Toby Avery, it's very clear that his grandfather was a student. And so this is, again, you know, we're constantly expanding our knowledge of these people who lived in the 19th and early 20th century. Now, as for students of photography, there was one in particular, and her name was Josephine Townsend Davis. And she was a girl on the island who, in the latter part of his life, again, I think as his eyesight began to fail, he relied heavily on her to help print his photographs for commercial purposes, for sale in his studio. And when he died in 1925, although his housekeeper inherited the contents of the house and the house itself, there was an arrangement whereby Josephine Townsend Davis was given his camera and his negatives. And she had been, I think, his primary student as far as photography was concerned. She went on to be a fine photographer in her own right, after his death in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and responding again to the commercial aspect of the island, but creating high quality photography. She created a whole line of very high quality art photographs of the island, many of which we treasure today. There's one in particular that's been reproduced in recent years of the Sarah Kent cottage with the breakers, breaking on the rocks below. It's a wonderful photograph by her. She's the reason we have the negatives, because when she died in 1981, she left them to a nephew, and it's from the nephew's estate that we were able to rescue the negatives, and we have them today. We wouldn't even begin to know about the photography of Trisket had she not preserved his negatives and passed them down in his family.
I see a good 1-2 punch here in the questions. We have both, let's see, Elizabeth Pardo and anonymous attendee are curious about how he related to other artists of the island. Is this person a sort of a recluse and a hermit, or is he part of a growing colony there? The specific question that I'm very interested in that anonymous attendee puts in is, did he have any thoughts about the new artists of the early 20th century, which many of us are biased in thinking is when things really take off on Monhegan? Robert Henry, Edward Redfield, George Bellows, Edward Hopper, all these big names of American art history. Does he ever offer us any recollections of these new young guns coming up?
Well, very good question. Ed or Jen can correct me, but I think he was included in the 1914 exhibit. Was he, Jen? Did he show in that exhibit? I think he did.
Put you on the spot.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm hoping Ed can pipe up here. I would have to double check. It's been a few years since I've visited.
I think he was invited to exhibit there. But to answer the question, I wish we knew a lot more about that aspect of his life. The impression I get from the few recollections that we have of him in his Monhegan period from the 1890s until his death in 1925 is that, he was a private person, but by the same token, I don't think he was a recluse or a hermit. I mean, in many ways, it's sort of parallel to Homer in that Homer chose to live actually in the middle of a summer colony with hotels all around him. And he sought his privacy in order to create his great work. But at the same time, he was not completely divorced of his surroundings. And I think there was probably a delicate balance between his privacy and his creativity and his life as a member of the village as well. That's the general impression, but sadly, we don't have enough firsthand descriptions or accounts of him and his life on the island to maybe answer that question in depth.
I did check quickly, and yes, he was included in the
I thought he was, and I think that the impression I got was that from the few things I know, the few things that I've read, is that he was comfortable with the changes of other artists coming on to the island. He was in many ways looked upon by the end of his life as a kind of a pioneer, really. Do
you want to nominate any, Jen? I see lots of good questions here.
Oh, goodness. I would like to nominate Frank Goodyear's question about, let me see if I can see this whole thing. He says, Trisket favored landscape, obviously. Could you speculate? Oh no, it just moved.
Sorry, I clicked answer.
Oh dear.
The answer time.
A moving question.
Could you speculate about why? Could you speculate about why people don't figure more prominently in his watercolors and photographs? Sorry about that, and thanks for joining us, Frank.
Right. Well, I think it may go back in part to his training back in England, back in the mid-19th century. I mean, if you consider he was born in 1846, he's probably training in London at the Royal Watercolor Society, maybe in the 1860s and late 50s, early 60s. And I think that he was trained in a tradition that was very much focused on landscape painting. And that certainly is a long tradition in the 18th and the 19th century in England with watercolor painting. It's an interesting question. And some of his earlier watercolors, like the one we saw in New Hampshire, there are a few people. There's a wonderful one on Grand Manan, where he shows, again, it's an early one from the 1870s, where he shows people, ladies in Victorian dress, standing out on this rock and so on. But unlike Homer, who of course is very figure-oriented as well as landscape-oriented, it's a very good point. You see very few actual figures in Triskett's work. Yeah. And I can only accord it to a very classical English training.
I see one familiar name I want to be sure to call out. One of my favorite people in the world, Dr. Kathy Foster of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, is one of the preeminent scholars of watercolor in the world, who did some really incredible work on this medium for a recent exhibition. And we seem to have had the honor of introducing her to Trisket. So good work, Earle. She is asking about the primary repositories of Trisket's work. Where can we learn more about this artist?
Very good question. Well, I would say in terms of public repositories, that the Monhegan Museum probably has the most complete collection. In addition to that, once I became interested in Trisket, and a very dear and close friend of mine, the late Sally W. Rand, who spent many of the summers of her long life on Monhegan, she became very interested as well. And we collected a number of them back in the 90s when I was doing this work. And then Sally and I felt that on the one hand, there were several of these that were of the quality that they should go to the Monhegan Museum. And in fact, one or two that you saw today were either gifts of Sally or myself to the Monhegan Museum. But we also felt very strongly that Trisket had very little presence in Maine museums on the mainland. There is a very fine Trisket that was given by another artist, an artist of the 20th century, Leo Meisner, and his wife to the Farnsworth, a wonderful one of the fish houses. But Sally and I felt that he deserved presence on the mainland, and where the show of 2002 went from the Monhegan Museum to the Portland Museum of Art, Sally and I gave a representative collection of Triskets to the Portland Museum of Art. They had not had any previously. If you go to their online catalog, I think there are something like a dozen Triskets. It's a little sort of representative collection. So they have a good group. There are a few at the MFA that have actually been there since the late 19th century, since Trisket was actually painting in Boston. And there are others scattered about. But to be honest with you, I think he is still, after all the study and interest and so on, still very much an unappreciated watercolor artist. And that's why we're here tonight.
I see a couple of questions we might be able to fuse into one on the technical. Other people who are as fascinated as I am by this hybrid process where he sort of does his do-it-yourself chromolithography and invents this colored reproductive medium. Many of us who are relative neophytes of photography think of a photographic print as slick and not inclined to retain watercolor that would bead up and roll off. So can you help us understand how the heck this would have worked? One person is even getting to the level of what kind of paper might he be using. Do you have any sense of that technique?
I really need to call on Susan Danley if she's in the audience for this. She's a much more knowledgeable scholar of the technical processes of the late 19th and early 20th century. I can only assume, Will, and I'm just giving an off-the-cuff answer here, I don't actually know the answer, that he must have chosen papers that may have had some kind of surface, some kind of surface grain to them to be able to retain that color. I know exactly what you mean. I mean, there were definitely very very slick, very shiny photographic papers used in the late 19th, early 20th century. But then, you know, you see gravure-like papers, you see the cyanotypes, the paper that's used to print cyanotypes in this period. And there's definitely a surface to it, a grain to it. So I suspect that part of it had to do with his knowledge of photography and his ability to know how to choose the right paper and manipulate it.
Makes sense. Any others you want to call out, Jen?
Oh, let's see.
There's one quick question is, do we have any evidence that he was ever connected with Rockwell Kent? Any overlap, any friendship there?
No, we don't. I mean, clearly, I'm sure that they would have at least passed on the paths together in that he was living, you know, by the 1905 to 10 period, when Rockwell Kent was spending most of his time on the island. Trisket was living by that time, living here full time. So I'm sure they would have met. They probably would have talked. It's just that we don't have any, as far as I know anyway, we don't have any concrete evidence. One of the frustrating things in doing work on Trisket was, on the one hand, we had a large body, and this was Richard Malone, who was the scholar who worked on Trisket's life. Richard found a large amount of newspaper article material from the 1870s, 80s, and 90s when he was in the Boston area. But once he moves at the turn of the century to Monhegan, most of that stops, most of that press attention stops. As far as letters are concerned, we literally, I think, have only 2 or 3 letters in his hand to people written off the island. So there are large areas of his life that we know about, and areas that we know virtually nothing about.
Makes sense. There's a good one from Peter Falk. I clicked out answer live a while ago and I forgot to ask it about his relationship with his gallery Macbeth. Was this a good relationship, or did he, with that kind of satire of the mass market for mediocre paintings,
Right.
Did he rebel and just sort of do it yourself? You've given us a little sense of him practically selling things off the porch and not really needing a major art market apparatus. So how did he relate to dealers?
Well, I mean, we have, again, sadly, we have so little evidence. When you look at the surviving correspondence of Winslow Homer, a lot of it has to do with his writing from Prout's Neck in the 1880s, 90s, and early 1900s to his principal dealers, and talking about the paintings I've just done, what do you think they can bring, what he thinks they're worth, and so on. It's a very rich window into Homer as the purveyor of his own work, and as a very canny Yankee salesman, really, of his work. I suspect we have that one letter to Macbeth in which he talks about, here I'm sending you some watercolors, and by the way, you probably don't know where Monhegan is or what it looks like, so I'm going to tell you. We don't know much more than that. We do know that he was a frequent exhibitor in the watercolor exhibitions of the 1870s, 80s, and 90s in the Boston area, as well as elsewhere, and that those watercolors continued to be sent to Boston exhibits sporadically for the rest of his life, at least into the 19-teens. I wish that I could, it's a wonderful question, and I wish that I had the knowledge to answer it for Peter, but there's just such scant evidence, unlike Homer, where we have quite a few letters to dealers.
Understood. And that way, a fun challenge for an art historian, where the objects themselves are the evidence, and you have to just look closely at these things, live with them as you have, and really think about the stories they have to tell. I'll also defer to Jen if there's anything you want to call out, but I might suggest just two more. I see another good pairing here, which is questions about this fascination with Asian art, which is very convincing. We see what you see in these things. They do look like silk scroll paintings in some instances. The problem maybe that raises is that there is the decorative, another of these things at the fringes of the art world. Does that concept, the non-art, the pure visual pleasure of decoration, factor in Triskett's work for you? And do we know anything more? Of course, you've told us there's so little primary evidence, but do you have any reflections, I might say, on
the
what
only
it
thing
was about this?
the only thing that I can think of is with the Oriental influence is that it was a very strong presence, I would say, particularly in Boston and in New England in the late 19th century. We have, of course, many artists being aware of it. We also have the introduction of a lot of knowledge of Japanese culture coming from people who were making trips to Japan and coming back and writing accounts of their travels and actually collecting Japanese objects. One of the very good examples of this is a man who was a Portland, Maine native, Edward Sylvester Morse. And Edward Sylvester Morse first went down to the Boston area as a teenager, worked for Louis Agassiz at the Peabody Museum at Harvard, and then spent most of his career as a scientist and anthropologist at what is now the Peabody Essex, the Essex Institute in Salem. And in the 1880s, he took prolonged trips to Japan and brought back literally thousands of pieces of Japanese pottery as well as other Japanese artifacts, and wrote a major book called Japanese Houses and Their Surroundings, which influenced American architects of the 1880s and 90s. So it was in the air. And I suspect his life in Boston, he frequently encountered art that, and the Japanese prints and art that was inspired by them.
Makes sense. Maybe one kind of a more personal question to end on, when people are interested in how you felt drawn to this artist initially. What was it about Trisket that spoke to you? And then a related question might be, could you tell us where your intriguing title came from? What was that? Pathless.
Very good.
Words, I don't have it here in front of me, but yeah.
Well, I've been very interested in both the history of Maine artists and the history of Maine photographers since I was very young. And in the early 1990s, I discovered a cache of photographs of Edward Robinson from Thomaston. In fact, the summer before last, Jen did a wonderful exhibit of about 30 of his prints based on his negatives that are now owned by the Maine Historic Preservation Commission. He was a Thomaston man who did quite a few wonderful art photographs of Monhegan in the 1890s. In the early 1990s, when I discovered these photographs, I came out to the island one weekend and talked with Jackie and Julie Hudson to help me identify the locations of the photographs and to find out what they knew. And of course, they very dutifully helped me. And then at the end of our photography session, they said, well, these are very nice photographs, but do you know the photographs by our father, Eric Hudson? So that then led me to do research on Hudson. We printed the Hudson negatives, and that became the first of the two books on the Monhegan artist photographers, Eye for a Coast, Eric Hudson's work. And this was something that Jackie helped me greatly with. It was a wonderful project. And then as I worked on Hudson, I began to discover Trisket photographs, first in the files of the Monhegan Museum, and then led to this Davis family in the Mid-Coast region that had inherited many of Trisket's prints and negatives, and then was able to acquire those. And so it is through photography that I was led to Trisket as an artist. And that's kind of the saga, really.
Oh, you're muted, Mel. Well,
So there, yeah, sorry. The question was, what of Pathless Woods and Lonely Shores, that title you had?
Okay, maybe this is a good point to end on.
Yeah.
If people will forbear with British Victorian poetry. There's an indication that Trisket was particularly enamored, and I think it's so emblematic of his life on Monhegan, with a passage from Childe Harold's Pilgrimage by Lord Byron. And we'll go out on this note. There is a pleasure in the pathless woods. There is a rapture on the lonely shore. There is society where none introduces. By the deep sea and music in its roar. I love not man the less, but nature more. From these our interviews in which I steal from all I may be or have been before, to mingle with the universe and feel what I can nor express, yet cannot conceal.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, Earle. I'll turn it back to you, Jen, for the conclusion.
thank you, Earle. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It was wonderful to be with you all, even though virtually, and to hear all of your knowledge about Trisket, Earle. And there are a few more questions that I'd like to send you by email if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah. But have a wonderful evening. And again, thank you for joining us, and we appreciate your support.